Please welcome David McMillan.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of everything, including some of the health information and other things as well. Mental health in particular, which is my area. If we get the screen down, and yes, my website, mcmillanmedia.com, is kind of important because I'm going to be showing a lot of slides tonight, but I'm going to be zipping through them pretty quickly because I got so much. And so there'll be things you won't be able to read and take the time, but you can go on my website because all the slides are there. In fact, there's more slides on my website, mcmillanmedia.com, than I'm going to show you tonight. So with that in mind, let's see if we can get this technology to work. Yeah, it's nice. I'm going to give you some background on visual storytelling because I became fascinated with this idea of trying to present the Cayce material visually and creating some 3D models and all of that. And some of the projects I've done, so you can see on my Atlantis project where I'm sort of heading with that because I'm sort of in the middle of it. And so I'll give you a progress report on the Atlantis project and some samples of that. Hopefully we'll have time for question and answer period toward the end. And again, all the slides are on my website at that address. And I'll give you that URL at the end so you'll have it. Now, in terms of the Atlantis itself, the readings kept emphasizing the relevance aspect. So it's not just like an old story, but that it's relevant to our lives today. And of course, many of the people got life readings to make it relevant to them, but the Cayce readings kept insisting that if you look around at the world today, you'll see that we're reliving Atlantis. And we made some bad choices back then and destroyed ourselves and so forth, and we've got to do better now. So I'm going to try to emphasize that relevance as we go along with some of the materials. And of course, the whole question of fact or fiction of Atlantis goes clear back to Plato. When he wrote his dialogues, they were questioning back then whether or not it was fact or fiction. Of course, the readings themselves talk about presenting material on Atlantis or the Mayans or Egypt and making it colorful, making it drawings and telling the storytelling aspect in color. They actually emphasize that. So I kind of took them literally, and I did some research on what's called storyboarding that's used for making movies. And so you have these illustrations that sort of capture the essence of something. They're not great art or anything, but they just try to get the story across. And I did some study on that and actually purchased some software that they use for storyboarding. And I got to looking through the readings and noticing they would describe the Atlanteans, their clothing, and they wore trousers and coats, and the length of the coat determined their social status and that sort of thing. And he actually gave descriptions of how tall and the weight and the eyes and the hair and everything about some of these individuals. Now, Hept-supht was a particularly important Atlantean that we're going to be talking about quite a bit tonight. And there's an image I created with this software, a 3D model of what he might have looked like. And my first project was Egypt, just because it was such a big, epic story, and there was so much visual material available and descriptions and such. And I began by studying the people and the geography, the same thing I'm doing with Atlantis, by the way. And the Rata, are you familiar with Rata, the story of Rata, who is Edgar Cayce in a past lifetime, this high priest of Egypt? Well, I created these 3D models of the stories, and some of them, like this composite being here, is very relevant to Atlantis, this mixture of animal and human characteristics of our mythological creatures. The temple activities, the Atlanteans were very involved with that, and probably some of that came directly from Atlantis. The social engineering, and of course the whole sensuality business and the sex aspect. We're going to be talking a little bit about Atlantis and the whole sex thing that was going on there tonight. There was some plots and some deceptions and the rise and fall of this great individual. And so I tried to portray all of that visually by creating 3D models and put it in color. And of course, the Atlanteans were very important with the models. Now, there's Hept-supht again back there. See, he was in on this, and another Atlantean, and Hermes, perhaps a past life of Jesus, was the architect of the Great Pyramid. And you get these monuments. There's Rata. He had to be rejuvenated. The whole business was so stressful to him, it wore him out. So he had to be rejuvenated. And in doing that project, I really had to come to terms with Atlantis, because the Atlanteans had migrated, many of them, to Egypt before their land sunk. And so we have some of these powerful Atlanteans coming in, and they were able to play a part of that. So I had to research that, and I actually found out that Ra-Ta, the high priest, made a trip to Atlantis and to learn about the Law of One and their culture. There's Hept-supht showing him around. He learned about their crystal technology, I'm sure, and their power stations. Now here's Hept-supht. He actually, after Ra-Ta came back to Egypt, shortly thereafter, Hept-supht, this Atlantean, came to Egypt and took up residence there. Apparently Ra-Ta really made an impression on him, because he sort of became Ra-Ta's sidekick and buddy and helper. So I wrote all of this up with the text and the graphics and put it into a book form and even a CD. And when I got done, I realized, well, I really do need to do an Atlantis project, and perhaps even something on Persia. There were a couple of great stories where I could create a lot of images and do the visual storytelling. But to tell you the truth, it's so much work to create these 3D models, and it takes so long. The whole Atlantis thing, I just realized just by tapping into it a little bit, boy, that's a massive project. And so I sort of took the lazy way out in terms of storytelling. I focused on the life and times of Jesus, because there's so much classical art that I could tap into. Of course, I had to create some of it myself. And then I moved on and focused on the reincarnational history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, again, because there was so much art available. But I actually created, now there's the gates of Troy, for example. And Edgar Cayce had a past life as a gatekeeper there. He was the one that opened up the gates and let the Trojan horse in, that kind of stuff. So fascinating stuff there. Edgar Cayce's wife apparently had a past life as a daughter of Socrates, and there she is talking to her dad. So I created that stuff, and I put it to music and created some DVDs. And that's kind of what I'm going to be trying to do with Atlantis. I'm trying to give you a little background of where I'm headed with all of this. So I wrapped up ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and I had my list of projects, and was Atlantis at the bottom. I was holding off on the last because I knew it was going to be so big and so tough, and so I thought, well, I'll kind of ease into it. Well, there was a problem, and I'll tell you about that. I started on the ancient history of Britain and France, because they kind of go together in the Cayce materials, and there's just lots of historical information in the readings. But what I bumped up against was Atlantis right off the bat in terms of where the Britons came from. And Edgar Cayce said the Britons, the people of Britain, were descended from the people from the Pyrenees. And of course, if you know anything about Atlantis, the Cayce story of Atlantis, the Pyrenees, that mountain range between France and Spain, that was one of the locations that the Atlanteans migrated to before Atlantis sunk. And so when he says that the Britons had descended from these people from the Pyrenees, I got to wondering, could there be a connection there with the Atlanteans? And it just so happens that the latest genetic research has pointed out that yes, the people of Britain, the ancient people of Britain, and most of the people there today, there's a predominance of the genetics from the people from the Pyrenees, the Basque. And of course, with all the monuments and so forth, the mystery of that, I got to thinking, well, maybe I better hold off on doing Britain and do a little more research on Atlantis, because I wouldn't want to miss out on something really major about early Britain. And I ran into the same thing with France when I went to do it, because yes, there's all that historical stuff, but there's cave art, and there's actually, the reading said there was a temple built by the people of the Law of One at Calais, those white chalk cliffs along the English Channel. And so the migrations from out of the Pyrenees at the end of the last ice age up into Europe. And there were some things in the readings that kind of corresponded to that as well as populating Britain, of course. And so the possibility that the Atlanteans may have been somehow involved in early France entered my mind. And of course, Edgar Cayce said that when the Atlanteans came to the Pyrenees, there were already people there. And those people that were there came from North Africa and the Carpathian region of Caucasus. Okay? Now what's interesting, I started to look into that a little bit, and sure enough, the scientific literature, when they look at the uniqueness of the Basque, their unique language, and their unique genetics and so forth, they're so distinctive, that's where the scientists are looking for clues as to where that uniqueness comes from, the same place that Edgar Cayce highlighted in his readings. And of course, they've got the large stone monuments and the cave art and all that sort of stuff. So I actually wrote that up into an article and put it on my website. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's fairly scholarly, so you can go on my website and check that out if you're interested. And so even trying to do something on the Americas, I kept bumping up against Atlantis. You know, the Iroquois, who were descended from the Atlanteans, the red men of the Native Americans, and of course the Mayans and the Incas. And so at a certain point, I just realized, you know, just cut it out. Just go to Atlantis, do the research, and just, you know, dedicate yourself to it until you get to it. Now, I'm somewhere in the middle, so that's why I say I'm going to give you kind of an update as to where I am and a sampling. Like with the Egypt project, I started out by thinking about the land of Atlantis. Now, I've already given you quite a bit about Atlantis, if you've been paying attention. I've been giving you where the Atlanteans migrated to. Egypt, the Pyrenees, the Americas, okay? So we're going to come back and revisit that with the legacy toward the end. But for now, let's just take the land itself. I went and studied Plato, because Plato gave his dialogues, and he talked a lot about Atlantis, where it was and what it was. He described this capital city of Atlantis designed in a circle, and there was alternating concentric circles of water and land, and there was a temple and a palace at the center and so forth, and the whole business was very circular, which is going to be important when we look at the law of one, because the circle was their symbol, you see. We will come back to that. Of course, I studied the other sources, the books and so forth, that talked about the land being either a large island or like a continent-sized landmass out in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Cayce readings said that the Atlantis was between the Gulf of Mexico and the Mediterranean, so it's in the North Atlantic region. He said it was about the size of Europe if you included Asia in Europe, which is a little bit tricky, but that's a pretty good sized landmass. And he said if you want to represent the shape of Atlantis, he said you could use Australia. That'd be pretty close. Or he said you could use Asia if you made certain indentations in it, that would get you close enough if you were doing like an A.R.E chart or something of that nature. That's what he was trying to explain. And he also, in one reading, spoke about the Sargasso Sea as an area of Atlantis that went down and sunk. And so what I did was I took a satellite image of the Earth surface. I mapped out the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is a mountain range, a huge mountain range that goes up through the Atlantic Ocean. Most of it's underwater now, but presumably that might have been part of Atlantis, because both Plato and the Cayce readings speak of the mountains of Atlantis. And there's that bluish kind of circles where the Sargasso Sea is. So you see, I've got this fairly large body of land between the Gulf of Mexico and the Mediterranean. There's mountains, there's the Sargasso Sea. It's shaped sort of like Australia. So maybe Atlantis looks something like that. Just a rough idea, of course. And you see that brown area going up through, that's the mountain range. That's the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is so important. And the reason it's important because in some cases, apparently the upheavals and the periods of destruction came from those mountains. Or some mountains. If not those mountains, then which mountains? That's a question. That's kind of an open question, but that's kind of an obvious possibility. And he talked about the volcanic eruptions with these destructions, and certainly there's a lot of volcanoes in that mountain range. He actually spoke about a gathering in the mountaintops. So there were people, they were given warnings, of course, in all these destructions, because they were very psychic. And they had prophets and oracles. And so they were warned, and they gathered in the mountaintops and watched the water come in to destroy the land. So I created a 3D model. This is the visual part. A 3D model of this city based on Plato's description of this concentric circles and this capital city, which is very consistent with what the readings talked about. And both the readings and the Cayce materials talk about a plains of Atlantis around this city and the mountains. So there you have the mountains, and you have some people gathered up there in the mountains because they've been warned. And of course, the tsunami came, or whatever you want to call it. The water came and destroyed it. And there were many destructions of various types. And so this is describing one of them. So I'm just trying to portray that a little bit visually. And again, I wrote that up in an article, and it's on my website. So if you're interested in the geography of Atlantis, just go to my website. Now, in terms of origins, the readings really emphasize that it's about spirit. You really have to understand spirit if you're going to understand Atlantis, because spiritual beings, souls, created in the image of God, were making their way through the universe, sort of exploring and sort of being co-creators with the creative force. And some of them made their way to this solar system and came into this planet, and they were supposed to be caretakers. He compared it to a vineyard, and that these souls were like to be the caretakers of the vineyard, watch over and be stewards. But the problem is they also had these creative abilities, so they could project thought forms, and they created thought forms and then pushed themselves into the thought forms and started to take on materiality. Now, why did they do that? Because they wanted to experience the senses, sensuality of the flesh. And so this process of the soul coming in is called involution, and then going back out is evolution, and it can depict it visually like this. Involution, the sweep down into materiality and flesh. Evolution, which is what we're supposed to be doing now, evolving back toward our source, see? But that's what was happening in Atlantis, particularly this involution coming into flesh from spirit. It wasn't part of the plan. The readings are very clear. It wasn't part of the plan. I think of it as sort of like they were writing a screenplay and they wrote themselves into the screenplay. You see? They were supposed to be caretakers and co-creators and keeping an eye on things, but they got involved in creation itself at a physical level, which created a lot of problems all along the way, and we're going to be looking at those. The readings use the terms entrapment, entanglement, encasement to describe this process of how souls got stuck in physical bodies. Now, there's this individual, Amilius, that's talked about quite a bit, who the readings say were a past life of Jesus. And Amilius was probably around a little over 100,000 years ago. So we're talking in a pretty big time span here. Some of the readings refer back to 200,000 years and beyond. And so maybe 100,000 years ago, some of this was going on where Amilius witnessed this process of involution, and these beings who were not entirely materialized. They were sort of thought forms, but they were starting to take on flesh. They were sort of like amoebas. They were able to change their form, see, because they hadn't become totally rigid and materialized and hardened yet. And they were also like chameleons, so they could sort of blend in with their environments and take on the characteristics of the environments. And of course, they were very much interested in experiencing the senses, the sensuality. They wanted that, because the animals could experience that, and they realized that, and they wanted that too. They wanted to be able to get into flesh and experience the sensuality of being in the earth. So here's a little image of like a thought form being, not fully materialized, a little bit like a chameleon that could sort of blend in with the territory in the background. And of course, some of these creatures, as they began to harden, because they were familiar with the animal forms and they were probably experimented with some of those too, we ended up with some very unusual creatures here called composite beings, or mythological creatures that were part human and part animal. And the readings say that some of these creatures had an extra eye, and that they also had extra arms and legs, which could come in pretty handy if you were harvesting grapes, by the way. And I'm going to come back and provide a social context for this and creating this image. Of course, there's the mountains in the background. Those are the mountains of Atlantis and all the rest. Now, this ability for psychogenesis, co-creative psychogenesis, not only could they project thought forms and then push themselves into the thought forms, but once there, they still had enough of this spirit of this energy of spirit, they could project other thought forms, which became sort of creatures on their own as well. Okay? Now, these other thought forms did not have souls. They were not able to create souls. Only God could create souls, but they could create these other forms. And some of these other forms get to be a little problem later on too, as we'll see. The readings speak of transposition. And transposition is the ability to manifest. And so these early Atlanteans were very psychic and had this ability to imagine something, and there it was. And they could transpose themselves from one part of the universe to another. So like teleportation. So they had some very unique abilities. I think of it a little bit like Jesus with some of his miracles. You know, the loaves and the fishes and turning the water into wine. So apparently these early Atlanteans could do that as just a matter of fact, because they were still had enough of that energy of spirit, and they were close enough to spirit. But as time goes on, they start to lose that closeness to spirit, and they start to lose some of these abilities. And another interesting thing about some of these early Atlanteans is that they were androgynous. They were of the double sex. In other words, male and female in the same body. Interesting concept. So when I did a little research on that and I looked at the modern biology literature, because I'm trying to make this relevant to what we're going through today, I found out that biology, we have endogenous humans and other creatures now, and there's a whole spectrum of sexuality. It's not just male and female from a strictly biological standpoint. And not only that, in addition to the biology of androgyny, there's social and psychological androgyny. So if you look around at the culture today, you'll see people, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, isn't it? The guys and the girls and so forth, what are they and all of that? Well, that's part of what was going on in Atlantis. Because souls were not inherently male or female. They could be both. Now, one of my favorite stories in terms of the visual storytelling part of this was A.R.E, who was one of these androgynous beings, a powerful ruler. Now, and this was a past life of Gladys Davis, Edgar Cayce's personal secretary. Okay? And it turns out she was androgynous, but Cayce said she had a feminine body because the females were stronger back then. So, women's liberation, perhaps, or whatever. And Edgar Cayce was the male part of that soul entity in the background. So you had the twin souls, Edgar and Gladys, in Atlantis, with Gladys out front as A.R.E. But she ran into a little bit of a problem. She had this double sex, and she didn't need to have sex to progenerate, to reproduce. But she had got her eyes stuck on one of these beings of a lower class, because she was upper class, definitely. And she ended up having a fling with this guy, and it didn't work out so well, and she ended up pretty depressed. And actually, this whole business, this actually produced some karma, and she said she was aware of that karma carrying even into the 20th century from that relationship and that mistake that she made back then.
The class system, that part of India, the class system of India is based on that?
I'm not sure. I'm going to have to hold off on the questions, though, Alan, because I got 260 slides here tonight, so I got to keep moving along. A.R.E, very interesting character. I had a lot of fun with that. Now, it just so happens, you remember, Plato was the first one to really talk a lot about Atlantis in the classical literature. He also had a theory about sexuality and androgyny. And his theory was that souls started out as androgynous, male and female, and then they were split. Of course, the readings talk about the division of the sexes and the separation of the sexes. So Plato said they were split into male and female, and then they spend eternity wandering around trying to hook back up and become the whole being again, which explains the attraction of the opposite sexes. But kind of interesting from the standpoint of twin souls and the whole business of androgyny in Atlantis, don't you think? With Plato, you kind of wonder. There's a lot of stuff in Plato that matches the readings very closely. So I wrote an article on sex in Atlantis and put it on my website. And I'm still working on the 3D modeling part of that, because you can imagine the visual storytelling of sex in Atlantis could get a little tricky. So I'm trying to avoid an X-rated label on that part of it when I create the DVDs. I haven't figured out how to do some of that. Well, So as you can imagine, by this point in the story of Atlantis, things had become quite a mess with these composite beings and all this stuff that was going on. And so something had to be done, and what was done was there was a creation of an ideal human form, and these were projected into the earth by God. So this was a creation of God and not of these souls, into the 5 races, which took on the color of the, remember that these souls are adapting to their local environments. So the skin tone and so forth match the environment. He said you wouldn't have ice in the equator or whatever, and so these forms had evolved that. But what was really important, I think, was the senses. Each of the 5 projections took on a different aspect of the 5 senses so they could focus on it. You see, we're getting back to the reason the soul came in and got stuck in flesh in the first place, because of the senses. So here's a way to work through and get your senses back in alignment. Of course, the Atlanteans were the red race. And as they became more hardened, more material, they needed shelter, and the readings say in the beginning they were living in trees, in nests in trees, and in caves, kind of primitive. But as they developed a society, they developed buildings and all the rest, and they developed a social structure, again, sort of based on the spiritual premise. Remember, we're trying to keep this spiritual premise that the readings kept insisting that you see Atlantis through this lens of spirituality. And we have this upper class, at least initially. Later on, they get kind of demoted some, but the Law of One, who were focused more on spirituality. They were religious and social authorities. You had kings and rulers and priests and priestesses of the Law of One. And the Law of One, of course, is one God, or the oneness of all, that we're all connected together. They focused on the fruits of the Spirit and that sort of thing. Whereas the Belial class was more what we think of as today as probably sort of atheistic materialist. You know, look out for number one, survival of the fittest, greed is good. Just look around at the world. You'll see some of both of these consciousness out there still. And then there was this lower class of the workers, or the laborers, also called the things, the slaves, the untouchables, automatons, some of them are called. And some of these may have been some of these thought forms that had not fully materialized, or they'd materialized but they weren't necessarily fully souls. Or perhaps they were souls, but they had just lost their way really badly. So we have a fairly stratified society where these boundaries are maintained, and there were struggles between the classes. As you can imagine, between the Law of One and the Belials, those are 2 really different philosophies. No wonder they had their problems. But some of the problems related to this lower class, what to do with the lower class. Do we keep them submerged? Do we keep them as slave labor? Or do we try to raise them up and help them out and educate them and become more aware so they can evolve, you see? And this lower class, in one reading here, it describes them as sort of like domestic pets. So how many of you got pets? Cats or dogs or whatever? Aren't they precious? And they can be pretty darn smart, don't you think? And they can have emotions, almost a personality. Well, this lower class was like that. They had some intelligence, and they were very capable of doing things. It just, the reading said they weren't able to take care of themselves entirely, like a domesticated pet may not be able to take care of itself, you see. And so they were called machines even in some readings. That's the way they were thought of, as machines or automatons or things. And they would do the labors of the household and cultivate the fields. And some of them were artisans and craftsmen. But there was these disturbing forces that grew between the Law of One and the sons of Belial over what to do about this lower class. And this really got to be a problem for a lot of these people. So there was this individual, Asmen-n, who was a young, apparently sort of a youngish Atlantean. It's hard to know about age because some of these Atlanteans would live for thousands of years. because they weren't fully materialized, and they also had some technology they could regenerate themselves. But they apparently sort of young and pure, and the term that the readings used was that there was this Belial that had an eye on her, and there was some debauchery involved. So she got taken in and seduced and so forth. And so here we are, Asmen-n, sweet young thing. Isn't she cute? Law of one, pureness and innocence and all the rest. And there she is with her Belial boyfriend, and who is not such a nice guy. And she, almost in all these cases, they came back in the 20th century and had the same people in their lives. So this gal had this guy in her life in the 20th century, some of the same issues the readings were warning her about because of the karma, you see. So it's relevant for that individual at least. And then, of course, we have these servants. This is the lower class. So I've got all three classes here represented, the law of one, the Belial, and the lower class of servants. Because the law of one, those people of the law of one did have this lower class working for them in many cases, and some of them wanted to keep the lower class submerged within the law of one, and some didn't. So there was actually some division within the law of one about what to do about the lower class. Now here's another individual. It's kind of an interesting story. Priestess Amine, priestess of the law of one. Apparently she had some personality problems, kind of a little bit hard to get along with, maybe kind of bossy or something. And she did a flip-flop, and she flip-flopped over to the Belials and had a raging good time there for a while, I'm guessing. Kind of went wild until the first of the destructive forces. And there was various periods of destruction, but the first period of destruction was caused by the Belials using their laser technology to blast away at some of those mountain ranges, probably. And they caused the first destruction. When that destruction happened, she probably had second thoughts about hooking up with the Belials, you see. So she flip-flopped back to the law of one, and apparently they took her in, and she rose up among the ranks, but she still had this personality problem. And the readings used the term combative turmoil that was surrounded her in that lifetime. And some of that carried over into the 20th century again. And in the middle here, I've got Abs, who was a law of one priest. And he was sort of a mediator between the factions within the law of one, trying to unify and heal those relationships, as well as try to raise up the lower class. So I'm looking forward to creating some more images with him in it, because he seemed like a fairly interesting character. And then we had Prince Elmur. Now, Prince Elmur was of the law of one, and particularly early on, the priests and the priestesses and the kings and the princesses and all of that, they tended to be of the law of one. They were the ruling class. They were the blue bloods, the royalty, the pure. And so Prince Elmur was one of these princes of the law of one, and the Belials targeted him for seduction. And what they wanted was, they wanted to use him to gain access to the temples of the law of one so they could desecrate the temples. And so they seduced him, and they betrayed him, and they used him, and he ended up pretty depressed about the whole thing. And here he is getting a lecture from some of his superiors in the law of one. And apparently he even had attempted suicide because of all of this back there in Atlantis. A real mess. And we have Eucles. Eucles was of the law of one, kind of an upper class who had some power. And in the 20th century, he kept having these visions of circular houses or buildings. And his reading said, you're having flashbacks of Atlantis, and that's the kind of house of the first temporal abodes in Atlantis were circular, like you're imagining. Now, Eucles had a little problem, too, with his power. He got on a power trip. He was kind of abusive, probably, to the lower class, and that created some soul loss for him. But in his readings, it not only talked about those circular houses, but it talked about circular cities and circular peoples, which is kind of interesting. Now, we've already looked at circular cities. Remember Plato's circular city? And the circular peoples, what does that mean? Well, the way he described it was that this was about differentiations, this social status and the social classes, and between the producers and the consumers. It was very much a social economic model of the spheres, again, kind of the circular aspect of this society. The producers and the distributors are like wholesale and retail and all of that. So the society, the people were organized in these circles or spheres, and that was part of the city layout as well. And of course, the circle is the symbol for the law of one, as it is the circle, the symbol for God in many cultures, because of the sense of unity and the completeness of the circle. And so I really tried to use the circle a lot in my illustrations, as you'll probably see. And of course, there it is in Plato, the circular city laid out in circles. And the society was structured based on that, so that the center was the most important, powerful people. The priests and the nobles were in their palaces and temples at the center. And then as you go out, it's the businessmen and the tradesmen and craftsmen out into the agriculture areas. And you went down in society based on where you were in the circles of the city, you see. So the circular buildings, the circular cities, the circular people. Now within that society, the women had a pretty strong role. And there was Queen Amilius, who the reading said she ruled with an iron hand. In other words, you know, a very strong-willed individual, so much so, being an Atlantean and being an extremist, which many of these Atlanteans were, she carried it too far to the point of causing her people to hate each other and produced wrath within the society. So you have these divisions of a fractured society with a lot of walls, and the walls, of course, help divide the people. Now, if you stop and think about these destructions of Atlantis to the land, and you have a fractured society, and you end up with a fractured land, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, at some symbolic level? Maybe they were creating this within their own society. I'm getting pretty close to a break time here. One more individual, Dar, who was was a law of one priest who recorded messages using the crystals. He was the recorder of the messages that came from the outer realm. And he was also a social advocate for that lower class, who were like machines. So here we have Dar. He's in the white robe. There's the four-armed grape pickers that I told you we'd come back to. They're doing their thing. And he's advocating for them with this Belial over here, who's the owner of this property. And standing next to him is Rhea, who is a high priestess, and she's an oracle. And she uses this crystal to deliver messages. Of course, he's the message taker, a recorder. But they are both advocates for the lower class. And there they are, out doing their thing. This is Princess Amilius. Casey said this is a beautiful woman. In fact, I was doing some background research on her today, because I'm doing little portraits on my website for each one of these characters. So there's a write-up and some images for every one. So I was doing hers today, and she was a dance teacher in the 20th century. Interestingly, she had a past life in the Americas where her playmates were Native Americans, and the reading said, aha, past life. He didn't say Atlantis, but he pretty clearly pointed out. Remember the Redskins and the Iroquois? And so she had that kind of connection. And this particular individual had a lot of opposition in her trying to advocate for the lower class. And her husband in the 20th century was the one she was having the most opposition with in Atlantis. Wow. And so the readings told her to find the common ground and look for the agreements rather than the disagreements. Now, Princess Amilius, as I said, an advocate of the lower class. And so here I created a little scenario. She's in the middle there on the left. That's Princess Amilius in the purple. Again, the sign of royalty. And the other four ladies there with her, they're priestesses and another princess and pretty much people that work in the temple. All five of those individuals were advocating for the lower class. And it turns out that this is before the second period of destruction, which was, sort of in the middle of the Atlantean story. But all five of those individuals had lifetimes that Cayce in their life readings came back. They reincarnated in Egypt, and they did the same sorts of things, working in the temples, helping out the people, the lower class, same thing they did in Atlantis. And then, of course, they all reincarnated in the 20th century and got readings from Edgar Cayce. So you almost get a sense of like a little soul group there, kind of working with the same agenda in Atlantis. And there's the workers out in the field doing their agricultural work. And on the right side, the opposition, as it were. Now, on the right side, there's a couple of those are Belials, and a couple of them are from the Law of One. Remember, I told you some of the Law of One actually used this slave labor. And there was a division within the Law of One. And Mealy, part of the problem she was having was not just with the Belials, she was having problems from the authorities within the Law of One. They didn't like what she was doing. They didn't want her advocating for the lower class. Kind of interesting, huh? So on the right side there, a couple of those people, as we go along, you'll see them. They're of the Law of One, but they've sort of adopted some of the Belial philosophy, that materialistic sense of things, you see. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic there of where all these different aspects, the splits and the divisions within the society. And in particular, there was this fellow called Ax-el-Tan. Now, what's interesting about him was that his mother was of the Law of One, but his father was a mixed, was impure. The readings say he was impure. So he was a Belial, or he was one of these composite sort of beings, because a lot of these, there was apparently a lot of these appendages on some of these creatures. Now, the Atlanteans tended to work that out in their temples. And so when they came to Egypt, they could provide some help in the Temple of Sacrifice on how to do that. But at any rate, Ax-el-Tan was of mixed heritage. And through the temple activities, he was able to get himself raised up and become a member of society. And the readings describe him as an Atlantean warrior. He was a warrior for the Law of One. So at times, this friction between the classes, and particularly between the Law of One and the Belials, one reading described it as, let's see, it's like a propaganda war. In other words, sort of like the red and blue states now, you know, and how not getting along, in other words. But at times, you get the feeling that actually there was some bloodshed, perhaps, and it actually became violent. So at any rate, he was of this warrior type. And I have him confronting one of the Belial priests, because the Belials had their priests and had their temples too. And then speaking of the temples, there were many temples in Atlantis. Sometimes we think of the temple in Atlantis, but actually there were many temples. Temple of Light, Temple of Fire, the Temple of the Sun, and in different cities had their temples. And the temples had various and numerous activities, including health and healing and nursing, teaching, ministering, power production, and some of that in the temples as well, and many different purposes. So very diverse stuff going on within the temples. Now in this illustration, I chose to focus on the healing aspect, and there was a reading given for a woman that said that she lived to be 6,000 years old, and she had worked a lot around the temples there in Poseida. And she rejuvenated herself and sort of laid the body aside and just kept on going. And she was a healer. And so I've got her doing this technique. If any of you are familiar with the Cayce manual therapy, that's what's called the third cervical release. It's an osteopathic move, holding the vasomotor, because the readings actually recommended that some of the people in the 20th century study manual therapy because they had practiced it before. So perhaps they were doing some hands-on sort of thing in these temples. Surely there would have been some crystal technology as well. And of course, here I have her during her regeneration thing. She's hooked up to a wet cell there, and I probably ought to get one of those, you know, carbon lamps or something, get some crystals in there, because they were using the crystals, and I probably will create a scene for her using crystal technology as part of her rejuvenation. I thought about having her doing the Stargate thing where she lays down in the stone, you know, sarcophagus kind of thing, and be rejuvenated, and I may do that yet. But the readings actually do talk about manual therapy, and they talk about the crystal therapy in these temples. Now, interesting for her, she lived so long, she actually lived before the final destruction. She migrated to the Yucatan and was in the temple there, but they had a lot of problems in Yucatan. And I think she got fed up with it. And so she just willed herself out of body and took flight to Jupiter, planetary sojourn. And I kind of wonder if maybe part of her rejuvenation process was that she would actually change bodies, because they could push themselves in and out of bodies, you see. And we can still do that, by the way, and we do it every night during sleep. We leave our bodies during sleep every night. All of us do. Okay, well, there was a temple of fire, and there were several individuals associated with that. And one of them was Princess Asmen. And I almost get the impression for her, of course, Atlanteans are extremist, and that she got kind of carried away with this fire worship business and may have burned herself, because she lost trust in herself and in others, and others lost trust in her. So she blew it big time somehow. And in the 20th century, her parents told them to keep an eye on this child to avoid any chance of fire or smoke in the lungs. So I have her kind of almost getting caught on fire here a little bit. And then, of course, there was Princess Ilax, the Princess of Fire, and she used fire for attunement. She was an oracle, a prophetess. So here's the scribe in the background writing down whatever messages are going to come through. And I got kind of concerned about her long sleeves there, so I came back and took those off. I didn't want her to have the same end as the other one, you see. And made a little temple there. They're doing the fire worship thing. Now, what's interesting about her was, of course, she was in Atlantis, and she went to Egypt. And when she went to Egypt, she took up with the natives in their native rebellion. And because there was rebellions, the Atlantean rebellion, the native rebellion, the Ibex rebellion. And she chose the natives rather than her own people. Kind of interesting. There's a split going on there. And of course, the natives lost out big time, and she was humbled by that and brought low. But she worked in the temples and helped people, just menial labor, helping people so much that she raised herself back up in the society and regained her power. And in fact, her teachings were adopted by Isis and Ra and Hermes in terms of sun god worship. So a pretty influential individual there. And then we had Asha and the sacrificial flames. And Asha was in the city of Poseida. We're going to be focusing on that in more detail just a little bit later. She had power, probably a ruler, and she caused many to walk in the flame, the sacrificial flame that burned in the holy mount. And she lost from this, so this was not good. This is not like New Age firewalking kind of thing. There's some serious burning going on here, probably. And so in creating this individual, here she is. She's pointing out, you're next. Next in line, here's the fire. Pretty serious fire there, because they were talking pretty serious fire, the sacred fires and the intermittent fires in these temples. And notice the temple itself, these large semicircular columns made out of onyx in this case, and they had these precious stones embedded in there so that the sun could kind of sparkle off of them. And there was actually one of the readings in the 364 series that described this temple in Poseida with the large semicircular columns of onyx and topaz inlaid with these precious and semi-precious stones that kind of sparkled or caught the rays of the sun, so much so that some people become sun worshipers just because of those gemstones. And I actually found this in a lot of readings. The gemstones were really, the crystals and the gemstones in the buildings were really important for the Atlanteans. Even after they went to Egypt, they were still doing it. And then within this temple that's described in that reading, there was the sacred fires and the intermittent fires, which I think may have had something to do, almost like perhaps like Old Faithful, the intermittent fires. So they built these temples perhaps around volcanic sort of places. And there was reason probably for that, because they were doing human sacrifice at certain times. And they were sacrificing prisoners from other lands. And they would take the ashes from the prisoners, put it in the waters, and make other prisoners drink that water. So you didn't want to be a prisoner with the Atlanteans during that period. And why were they doing that? Well, it might have been to instill fear in their enemies, but there could have been a ritual aspect, because there seemed to be as if the volcanic activities that was destroying the land at certain periods, they worshipped that fire, and so they could appease the nature forces. with their sacrifices so that the destructions wouldn't happen. You see, that may have been part of the reason they were doing this. So I created this temple, a circular temple, again, keeping with the circular theme. I put those large pillars there, the large columns, semicircular columns with the gemstones and all. Put a domed roof because sometimes they use domes. The power stations had domed roof. But it occurred to me if it's a temple of light or a temple of the sun or so forth, you needed the sun to sparkle on these gemstones. You couldn't have a roof on there. It'd be too dark in there. And certainly circular open-air temples were pretty common in ancient times. Not just, this kind of looks a little bit like Stonehenge, I know. And I'm not trying to say that Stonehenge was built by the Atlanteans or anything like that. But if you just have a circular temple that's open air so that the sunlight can get in and sparkle and so forth, well, maybe it looks something like that. And of course, there's the fires you can see a little bit. Here are some of the attendants at the temple, the priests and priestesses and some attendants and so forth. And there's the fire burning in the background. They've got kind of a worried look on their face because here's a prisoner being brought up to be sacrificed, see? So serious business. And a little flight, one of their aircraft there in the background. I tried to stick those in whenever I could. I had fun with the Atlantean technology. We're going to come to that in a minute. Okay, so we have Rhea, the interpreter of the white stone. Now remember, I showed you the picture of Rhea earlier out in the fields with the four-armed guys picking the grapes. So she was an advocate for the lower class. But she also was the interpreter of the white stones. She was a prophetess, an oracle. And she was one of these androgynous beings that had the capability of progeneration within herself. So very special. She was a high priestess. And with this white stone, it was a group process. So it was the concentration of the group that helped allow her to attune using this white stone. And tuned into the realm, the saint realm, as it were, to get these messages. So here we have Rhea with the white stone. I made this as a six-sided stone because the readings spoke of the six-sided stones so often as being important. The white stone, and there's Dar. Remember Dar, the message bearer, the message recorder. He's got his pen and pad there, and he's ready to take down whatever she says. And this is her group, the group concentration to help the attunement process, to help her attune and get the messages. Sort of like a little study group there, almost, doing a meditation. Now, there's a reading that mentions the crystal room or the palaces where they would gather and use the crystals for this attunement process. So I created a little crystal room for her there too. So maybe it was the crystal room, maybe it was in the temple that she was doing this attunement process. Now, Rhea, like so many of these members of the Law of One, were tempted by the Belials. And in her case, there was an individual from the Law of One that had adopted the Belial philosophy, and it was sort of hitting on her. And so she had to make some decisions as to what to do, whether or not to maintain her integrity, and she was very tempted. Now, she did not give in, apparently. Boy, was she tempted. And there's a couple different layers to this story. This is Rhea and her boyfriend. So you've got that level of the sexual attraction, which was very tempting for the sensuality, the sensory aspect was very tempting for these pure Atlanteans, whether or not to try it. I mean, you can relate to that. We can relate to that. And so there was, at that level, that was going on. And by the way, this also in the 20th century, this was one of her boyfriends, and they were having problems, and the readings were warning her, hey, remember this guy from Atlantis? Be careful now. He said, be careful you have the same ideal, because you didn't have the same ideal in Atlantis. That is the ideal in the 20th century that was emphasis. Now, another level to this, if you look in the background across the water, there's Dar back over there on the left. And on the right, there's one of these Belial priests. Because the Belials, just like with Prince Elmer, where they were trying to gain access to the temples, they were trying to, in several cases, they were trying to gain access to these priestesses and priests who were getting the messages and the knowledge. They wanted that knowledge. Knowledge is power. So they wanted that knowledge. They wanted to know what they were doing and how they did it so they could gain that. And they would use those people, and sometimes from the Law of One, the people would sort of sell their services or try to get something out of it. So I think there may have been that level as well in terms of Rhea, because she was at the top. I mean, she was the high priestess, the oracle, doing all this stuff. So interesting. Rhea is one of my favorite characters. And there's this other priestess in the temples who is every whit the woman, and apparently she had a lot of children by a lot of different associates. Kind of makes you, again, that sex and Atlantis thing. What was going on there, and was it going on in the temples? Or is this some part of the sacred progeneration, or what? Just exactly what? Because remember, in Egypt, they had this breeding program going on to produce the perfect individuals and so forth. And then, of course, there was Princess Ishuma, who had 17 sons by 17 different men. And some of these guys were not the top of the line. You get the feeling. And the older priests amongst the Law of One, they objected to some of these characters she was hanging out with. Now, apparently some of the younger priests were okay with it. Maybe they were in on it, but at any rate, so not only she's having these children, but she was leading the activities in the Temple of Light, and the priests from the Law of One and the priests from the Belials, neither one of them could control her. I mean, she was very strong-willed. And it's interesting to me that both of those different types of priests were involved with her and trying to influence her. It kind of makes you wonder, again, what the relationship was, because at times the Belials and the Law of One actually worked pretty closely together. So here is Ishuma with one of her progeny, a little boy standing there, and the priest from the Law of One and the priest from the Belial, and they're trying to, get her under control, and she's not having anything to do with it. She's her own gal, and she's going to do what she wants to do. Some of you may know who that is, in terms of at the A.R.E. So I'll say no more. Leave it there. We're going to keep the confidentiality. There was an individual called Arsen who was of the Law of One, but she got infatuated with the Belials and took up with the Belials. And her reading was very interesting. This was about the time of the Second Destructions. And there was a mixing of groups. In other words, these different stratifications were mixing, and they were producing offspring as beasts of burden or workers in the mills or clays, the lower class. So they actually had some kind of breeding program going on to produce these workers. And she was part of that, along with this connection she had with the Belials. So again, you have to kind of wonder, I mean, were these her offspring? Was she producing them, or was she progenerating them, or just exactly what was going on there? Because remember, some of the Law of One were okay with having the lower class and keeping them submerged, and using them that way. And there, in this reading, they talks about that some of these forms that were created, now we get more toward the thought form type of propagation, perhaps. Some of them were divine, and some of them were like monstrosities. And this got to be a problem with some of the monstrosities because the Atlanteans had to deal with an animal problem. Of course, part of that had to do with the whole business of the composite beings, the part animal, part human, the mythological creatures. And there was a lot more than just the Sphinx. I mean, and just Egypt. There's these carvings and these other things around in ancient civilizations all over the world. So this was a worldwide phenomenon, and the ancient peoples took it very seriously, as if it was real. It wasn't just magic to them. To them, it was real. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? And some of these animal appendages and such were feathers. There were goat feet and hooves of a horse. And of course, some of these composite beings were not so nice. They could be pretty violent and destructive, which was the case apparently in Atlantis, because they had to deal with that. And then parallel with that, there were these megafauna that were that regular science recognizes, the saber-toothed tigers, these giant animals, the cave bears and such, which could create quite a bit of problems for the humans if they were loose. And at some point, these megafauna suddenly became extinct, and one of the theories is that maybe humans had something to do with that. And then there's the other theory that maybe it was climate change. So that debate, climate or humans. And it turns out the Cayce readings recognize both of those causal factors in terms of the extinction of the megafauna. And this can go back over 50,000 years. And apparently there was a great congress where the nations of the world got together. I think it was probably in Atlantis. They don't really say on that particular case. The leader of the Congress was Tim, And what they decided was they were going to use the Atlantean technology to eliminate these beasts. The crystal technology, the death ray, the supercosmic ray. So here we have Tim, the leader of the conference. And Ajahel was the ruler of communications because they did have that capability by that time to communicate worldwide. The readings call it like an all-world broadcast that was sent out. He said the transportation was sort of like the graph, like a blimp. So here's maybe they look something like this. He said they used the animal hides as containers for the gases to get the lift, and then had a metal alloy structure that not only was structural, but it would capture the rays of the suns and store that energy for propulsion. And so, very interesting kind of crafts. I had fun. I didn't make that, but I found it. I just thought, boy, that sure looks like early Atlantean. And of course, here they are in their gazebo and having one of their meetings talking about what to do. And what they decided was to use this crystal technology and to destroy the animals in their gathering places. Now, exactly what the various quarters, the gathering places of the beasts. So what does that mean? They also talked about the pits, and that using the rays of the sun and these crystals, and this is where they tapped into the internal influences of the earth and caused the first period of destruction. So again, we come back to Atlantis, and I told you we'd come back to the mountain range, the mid-Atlantic ridge there, that brown streak through there, which if that was above water, what might that look like? Well, it so happens the mid-Atlantic ridge is above water in Iceland. So if you go to Iceland, they have a lot of volcanoes and mountains, and they have what's called this rift, where the plates, in plate tectonics, these plates are pulling apart and creating a rift. So that's the rift right there. There's two tectonic plates on either side, and it's a great tourist place. And it occurred to me, maybe these gathering places, these pits where the animals were hiding and reproducing, where they used their lasers and created these volcanic eruptions, maybe that was along the mid-Atlantic ridge, like in Iceland. And so I photoshopped and took the tourist out and put some megafauna in. And brought in some Atlanteans doing a little aerial survey here to find out where they were. And of course, you've heard of Nikola Tesla, probably an Atlantean if there ever was one. And he had this concept of the death ray, okay? Well, apparently the Atlanteans might have preceded him in that concept. And here's an aerial warship with this technology. So I created this little ray gun here with the death ray. They're going to go out and destroy these beasts. Now, the Belials were the big pushers for using this technology in a destructive way. The Law of One, it sounds like not so much. But they went along with it, but it was qualified. They said, we've got to send our supervisors, so they chose Prince Anzor to be a supervisor. Turns out the problem is he was not very good at it. The readings use the term indeterminate activity. In other words, he couldn't really make up his mind. He was kind of soft, and he goofed up. I mean, they had a major destruction there, and he wasn't paying attention. And there was also the priestess Estro-M, who was supposed to be keeping an eye on things, and she didn't do a very good job either. And maybe she was flirting with one of these Belial guys, who knows. A lot of that went on. Now, in the 20th century, she was a school teacher, and in her reading, she asked why she tended to be so harsh to her students about every little detail. And the reading says, well, remember Atlantis? And apparently it seemed to be pointing out, you didn't take any notes then, and you didn't take any details, and now you've come back and you're taking that on your children in the classroom. So a little bit of karma there, perhaps. And there they are, they're getting ready to do some blasting. And there was these volcanic upheavals and such to produce the islands. The continent got split up. And apparently they did not get rid of the animals because they had to come back and have another series of meetings at about the time of the second period of destruction, a few thousand or maybe several thousand years later. And Alinor was one of these, was a captain actually, and he had a submarine, a boat that could go on the water or under the water. So he may have used that to help transport the attendees to this conference. And there was Ohula, who was a daughter of the ruler of Atlantis, And she was an assistant to the entertainers for the conference. Now that sounds a little strange. Why would the ruler's daughter be an assistant to the entertainers? Unless she's just a party girl or something, you know. But anyway, her reading also talked of the secret forces of counsel to many. So here she is, she's assisting the entertainer, but she's actually really paying attention to the delegates and trying to get the inside dope on what's going on in the various lands, these secrets, you know. And so maybe she was working undercover for her father and collecting some data. Who knows? I don't know about these things entirely. But now they weren't able to get rid of the animals entirely either, because the second period of destruction came along, and maybe that was part of it. You don't really know what the outcome in that case was. But there was another series of meetings much later, right before the final destruction, and that was definitely in Egypt. At the time of Ra-Ta, these groups met. Ayuden was one of them. Kuden was another. And it mentions, and now they had the meeting, but this reading says that Ice, the entity found, nature, God, changed the poles and the animals were destroyed. So that gets back to that business of climate or the human activities, what destroyed the megafauna. This actually, the timing of this meeting is very close to what's called the Younger Dryas event. That tends to be associated with the extinction of the megafauna, which was a really sudden sort of ice age, cooled off very quickly, sort of like what he's describing there. So maybe that possibility of something going on there. And here's Kuden at his meeting, and they lived in tents and caves for that meeting. Wasn't the high-class accommodations of Atlantis for sure. And I've written an article about the animal problem. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff in these meetings, you can check that out on my website. Now we've talked a little bit about technology and Tesla, and another thing that he came up with was wireless transmission of electricity. Turns out the Atlanteans were doing that with this large crystal that would capture the solar energy or the starlight energy, and then it could be transmitted out for their ships and their various appliances and such. And one of the technicians for that was a guy named Asal-Sine. Now, Asal-Sine, he was responsible for the second period of destruction. He tuned the frequencies too high for this great crystal and created a problem. And one of the things that he did was he apparently set up these power substations. So you had this great crystal that would collect the energy and that would be broadcast out to the substations for distribution, so then it could be sent to the crafts and the homes and so forth. And that was his job, to transmit that energy out to the substations. Of course, if those substations are distributed around at some of these sensitive geological places where there's possible volcanic activity or such, and you tune that too high, well, there you have it, the second period of destructive forces, or upheavals, as they're sometimes called. So here we have Asal-Sine and the switches and stuff, and he's getting ready to throw the switch. Maybe that's the one that caused the second period of destruction. Or maybe it was a little more technologically advanced. I mean, apparently this technology was more advanced than what we have now, the readings say. So maybe it was all kind of confusing to him, or he just got negligent a little bit. But he definitely goofed up. It was unintentional. Now, with regard to this technology and this energy, this wireless energy, it could be sent out to the crafts, the aircrafts in particular. And so Asal-Me was a builder of planes. So now we're talking about rigid body aircraft, planes, not balloons, but planes. And he was a builder of the planes. And Amexel was a pilot, a captain. And so one of the readings described some of these aircraft, particularly toward the latter periods, was what Ezekiel described in the Old Testament. The wheels within a wheel. So you get that circular motif again, which is kind of interesting, because some people, when they describe or create images of the aircraft of Atlantis, make them kind of elongated, cigar-shaped, or whatever. And they may have been, but you don't really get a sense of that. The only real graphic description I found, if you use Ezekiel's description of a wheel within a wheel, you kind of get something more round. And some Atlantologists have pointed out that in the ancient Indian text, the Vimanas may have been something like what was in Atlantis, or maybe identical to what was in Atlantis. So I found this model of a Vimana, And I was kind of wondering, well, maybe it was something like that. So we have MXL, the pilot, and SLME, the plane builder, and they're in there trying out their latest model, taking it for a spin, to see what happens. Now, not only were they using the Great Crystal that way, but they had some technology to deal with gravity, anti-gravity, levitation, and such. And some of this seemed to be associated with what was called the night side forces. And this night side or invisible energy. Now, as Dave mentioned, I wrote an article about that. I'll come to that in a minute. But there was this individual, Sonal, who was he was a ruler with unlimited power in the sacred city of Pios, and he basically destroyed himself. Self-destruction, the readings say. So here we have Sonal, and he's showing off a little bit with this levitation, the anti-gravity thing with this ball, and he fries himself, or whatever. It's not real explicit what the self-destruction was. Now maybe it was more of a socio-political self-destruction, and the people turned on him, but you can almost get the feeling that he got a little too careless or a little too carried away with this energy, and a little too extremist, like the ruler who burned herself, and maybe he destroyed himself, consumed himself with this energy of the night side forces. And I did write that article. It was published in Venture and Inward, and I talk about the night side forces and dark energy and dark matter and anti-gravity and all the rest. And that's on my website, so if you're interested in that, you can check it out. Now, the readings do speak of the people of the universe, aliens and extraterrestrials and such, the various spheres. Of course, if you're paying attention to spirit again, I mean, we're extraterrestrials, right? As souls. We have that capability. We have planetary sojourns. We're out there to Arcturus and around. Souls are all over the universe. So the soul entities that we are, we're the citizens of the universe. So maybe some of that business of, this entering from the other spheres and potentially some of these aliens are warlike. There's passage between solar systems. Of course, remember the 6,000-year-old high priestess who took her flight to Jupiter and so forth. And we go to Arcturus from here. So this capability of passage between various parts of the universe. And there was this individual called Sigund who was said to be the keeper of the portals. Keeper of the portals. And the visitation of those from the outer spheres, and he received the messages from them. So he was a message keeper and a message bearer, Sigund. And he was the one that received the message about the final destruction of Atlantis. And he took charge and took responsibility to become a planner and a director in terms of the migrations, how that was going to all work out in the preserving of the records. So a very important individual here, Sigund, the message bearer and the keeper of the portal. So here we have Sigund and one of these portals and an entity perhaps coming into that. Looks a little bit like a Stargate, obviously. I mean, are we remembering some of this stuff or what? So I put it up in the mountains again because of the high places and sacredness of high places, and perhaps that would be a good place to have it. I also created I created an image of this more like a Star Trek teleporter, and I may work that over some more because again, in our culture, we have these images. It's not like it's coming out of nowhere. It's part of our consciousness today. Now here's Sigund having a meeting, and he's at the head of the table. He's in charge. And around the table, you may recognize some of these characters. There's Hept-supht and Axtel, who went to Egypt, along with the Princess Ilax, the Princess of Fire. She went to Egypt, so they got her. And of course, Axtel there, he's kind of full of himself. And he ends up being kind of a bully anyway when he goes to Egypt. And Princess Ilax, she steps back from, remember, she doesn't join his rebellion when she gets to Egypt. A little bit of visual storytelling here. And on the right side, we haven't met Iltar yet. He's on the right side, but he goes to the Yucatan. And there's the 6,000-year-old woman. She went to the Yucatan, of course, too. And there's Oran, who Cayce described as an Atlantean of the first water. It was in the background. He's very important, but he kind of kept back. He led from behind. And he's standing in kind of a little bit back of Sigund, who's in charge. Now, Siegen had quite a resume, so when I write up his article on him, I'm going to have a lot of fun because he did a lot of stuff. He was a really important Atlantean. And so, and by the way, Siegen, in terms of the migration, he went to the Pyrenees. Went to the Pyrenees and then went to the mountains of Greece, and he was involved in communication. Remember, he's the message bearer. He was in communications to draw in the members of the world for a convention there to unify the spiritual laws. So he continued on, but he went more the European route in terms of the migrations. Now the legacy, we've already talked about Hept-supht and the Hall of Records in Egypt, that repository buried underground there near the Sphinx. And Iltar went to the Yucatan, and he created a temple, which was destroyed, apparently not long afterwards, and they had to redo that. Now there's A.R.E in the background with the records, because he was involved with not only the migrations, but the transportation of the records. And again, he was a high-born Atlantean of the first water, kind of an interesting fellow. Not very much ego, which is kind of unusual for an Atlantean, really. And his readings said that it would be good for him to seek out these records that were put in 3 places. Of course, they were taken to Egypt, to the Yucatan, and a set of records were left in Poseidon, apparently, in a temple there. So his reading encouraged him to follow through because he was involved in all of that, and he could make good on that. And the readings insisted that the records would be found. And of course, a lot of people are trying to do that at 3 locations. So again, just to re-emphasize the relevancy of the stories of Atlantis, and I'm maybe halfway through the project, somewhere in the middle, so I've just given you a sampler here. I've got like 125 characters, and I've created maybe 40 of them, and a lot of scenes and things. So there's a lot of work to be done. This was a massive project, but I'm always trying to keep an eye on this business of relevancy. Is it relevant to us today? And if you look around at the world in a lot of different ways, yeah, we're doing it again. And the question is, are we going to make a mess of it again? So I told you a lot of this stuff is on my website. There's the URL at the bottom, macmillanmedia.com. If you get to the front page, over on the right side, there's that icon for the Atlantis Project. So just click on that, and it'll take you there, and you'll find articles and all kinds of stuff on Atlantis.